Good evening, everybody. Very warm welcome to the History and Policy, Trade Union and Employment Forum seminar on employment. I'm Sarah Veale. I'm going to be hosting the event as discreetly as I possibly can. I'm former head of the Equality and Employment Rights Department at the TUC, member obviously of the History and Policy, Trade Union and Employment Forum. Also for my sins, I have in the past been a board member of the EHRC, which I share with two other of our distinguished speakers who are coming up, and also the Women's National Commission and the ACAS Council. That's just giving you a little flavour of my past experience. I'm semi-retired now, which is wonderful. Anyway, just a quick outline of how the event's going to work. I've got three absolutely wonderful guest speakers to introduce, and I'll do each one as we come to them. The format is going to be that we'll start with our keynote speaker, Professor Sue Milner, and then we'll take our other two wonderful speakers, Kay and Caroline. I'm going to run straight through, as it were, without taking questions to each individually, because experience has certainly shown me that if you start letting people ask questions and make points after each speaker, you can kind of lose the coherence of the gathering. So I think we'll do it that way and then have plenty of time after the speakers have all made their contributions to have a debate and questions and so on. But there is a chat box, so do pop questions into there as we go along, and I'll make sure that those are drawn to the attention of our three speakers and indeed everybody else in the room. So please do make use of that. I'm keeping you all on mute while the speakers are speaking, and indeed throughout, but when you want to contribute, if you use the hand icon, I'll keep an eye open for hands being raised and obviously unmute you, or I believe you'll be able to unmute yourselves actually at that point. I don't think there's anything else that I need to say. So it gives me enormous pleasure to move on to introduce Professor Susan Milner from the University of Bath, who is the author of a really fantastic recently published book called Gender Equality and Employment Regulation in the New Labour Years, which was published 2022, I think, Sue, wasn't it? And I know she's working on a new publication, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about. So I'm very, very pleased to be able to welcome Sue here. She's a new member as well of the History and Policy, Trade Union and Employment Forum. So particularly keen to have her leading off this discussion on a very, very important topic that a lot of people have shown a lot of interest in, I'm glad to say. So without further ado, I think you've got some slides for us, Sue, and I'll hand over to you.
Try to. How's that?
Lovely. Yep, can everyone see the slides?
Yep.
Okay,
good.
So I start my... Hi everyone,
yeah,
I've got a lot to say, so I'm going to gallop like mad and see how much I get through reading from my notes. The publication that Sarah just mentioned, thank you Sarah, was an article in Historical Studies and Industrial Relations in 2022. But my book there on the screen is due out with Oxford University Press next week in hard copy, so yeah, please do take a look. In that book, it's based on research that I did during my Leverhulme Fellowship when I interviewed Sarah and Kay and maybe others in the room. Thank you very much. I looked at the evolution of policy, public policy on women and employment, and I took as the focal point the Women and Work Commission, which was convened nearly 20 years ago now. The reason I took that was because the Women and Work Commission took a broad-based approach to the question of the gender pay gap. And so 5 broad areas, and I track those 5 broad areas in the book. Obviously, I don't have time to go into all of that today, but I've introduced this idea of a stalled revolution, which I've used in the book. Paula England initially used this in relation to the USA. England's analysis highlights asymmetry in behavioural change in society. Women's greater labour market participation has not been matched by men's greater engagement in unpaid domestic labour. England argues that policy can and should encourage greater change and also encourage employers to support women in the workplace. And if we look at the gender pay gap, for example, since 1997, it's narrowed, but it illustrates this idea of a stalled revolution. It probably hasn't narrowed as much as we might have expected it to, given that there have been various initiatives in that period. And if I move on to my next slide, there are various indicators, not just the gender pay gap. The World Economic Forum in 2023 published a review of 146 countries. The UK came 43rd and did particularly badly on economic participation and opportunity. So it's about wages, income, and it's about position of women within all walks of public life, including organisational life. So it fits this idea of a stalled revolution. So you can see that in education, actually, the UK's were a bit below average, but actually young women have made strong progress in terms of educational attainment, and not just in in traditional subjects, non-STEM subjects, but increasingly in STEM subjects. Yet economic disadvantage starts with labour market entry and it widens throughout women's lifetimes. The World Economic Forum Index acknowledges that there have been a relatively high number of organisational initiatives in British companies, but that raises a question: why, if there have been a plethora of organisational initiatives, has change been so slow? So my argument starts with the observation that the battle for policy attention has been a long and hard one, part of which relates to the institutional structures of power and the attention paid to gender equality in the policy space. Political science emphasises the instrumental logic of policy attention. Instrumental logic depends on evidence that women require specific attention because that's the way to get their vote. And interestingly, Rachel Reeves has been talking about that this very week. This, alongside interventions from external bodies, the ILO and the EEC, is what campaigners use to secure policy attention for equal pay demands, which had been going on for decades, resulting in the Equal Pay Act 1970 and the Sex Discrimination Act 1975. So I'm going to review some of that, see how much I get through battle for policy attention through the years, but I just want to note two widespread perceptions relating to the nature of policy itself, which in interviews were articulated to me by some protagonists from the New Labour years, in fact. So first, the belief that given the multidimensional and persistent nature of the problem of women in, or facing women in employment, that it's too difficult to tackle. It's a wicked problem. It may be simply filed under the heading of ingrained cultural attitudes, which can change only slowly over time by themselves. And second belief that women, despite forming just over half the population, are a minority, and that policy cannot cater to minority needs. This second perception has hardened over time and resulted in an ideological anti-feminist backlash, which we associate today with the political right. But in a weaker form, I suggest it's been influential over a much longer period, and it's led women's rights campaigners to need to reframe their demands in universalistic terms. This can lead to women's rights becoming invisible in policy, and even more so the rights of the most vulnerable groups of women. So I'm going to get onto the initial phase in a moment, but just to say quickly, I don't think you said anything about this, Sarah, but I think we are planning to do a seminar on childcare later. So if most of us probably in the room, if we're starting somewhere, would start with childcare, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm not going to talk about the national minimum wage, which did make a big difference to the income of lower paid women on an hourly basis, not so much on a weekly basis. But I won't talk about that because it wasn't a policy that was specifically designed to address the needs of women in employment. I'm going to focus a little bit, again, given time, on two big initiatives from this longer period: gender pay gap reporting and the right to repress flexible working. We could also talk about public sector equality duties. I probably won't have time, but maybe in discussion. So in this initial phase, I've mentioned the Equal Pay Act, the Sex Discrimination Act. With this equality machinery was established a potentially strong legislative framework and an enforcement agency, the Equal Opportunities Commission, but with gaps and weaknesses which from the outset campaigners wanted to see addressed over the longer term. The equality machinery has never really lived up to its potential to be a powerful enforcement body, but it's had its moments. From the beginning, more often than not, it was hampered by underfunding, often also by lack of government engagement, sometimes by downright interference. Up to the present day, critical reviews by government and oversight by Parliament frequently highlighted governance and enforcement weaknesses without providing remedies. The impact of the Equal Pay Act, meanwhile, stalled after the initial transition period during which employers and trade unions had been pushed by government into reviewing their pay structures and bargaining practices. The main problem was a weak definition of equal pay based on same or similar work. In 1983, the Equal Pay Act was amended following an implementation review by the European Commission to allow claims for equal pay based on work of equal value. Over the next few years, the EOC used European case law to strengthen domestic law, most prominently in the case of Julie Hayward, backed by the EOC and the GMB, Hayward's Union. The EOC came into conflict with the British government, its funder, and this came to a head in 1989 over the EC's draft directive on gender equality, which would have required the UK to amend the Equal Pay Act to shift the burden of proof in sex discrimination and equal pay cases. The EOC's position was precarious, not just because it depended on government funding, but because its criticism of the weakness of equality legislation laid it open to accusations of ineffectiveness. And indeed, several Conservative MPs openly advocated dismantling the EOC at that time. In 1987, when Joanna Foster was about to take over as chair of the EOC, journalist Polly Toynbee wrote that equal rights activism was due for revival, although not yet 12 years into the EOC's work, it had become, quote, deeply unfashionable. So on to my next slide. When the equality and anti-discrimination legislation was adopted, it was recognised from the outset that the law could do only so much, particularly as enforcement through individual litigation, as we know, was just so difficult. Nancy Sear, Baroness Sear, who introduced the initial sex discrimination bill in the House of Lords, I've been doing a little bit of work recently on Nancy Sear, I'm fascinated by her. She spent a lot of time talking to business leaders about the need to make the law effective. So, speech in 1979, for example, only positive management action can put flesh on the bones of the law. Sear urged managers to get the facts, analyse the problems, set goals and timetables, train, communicate, cultivate and monitor. And I cite it because it could be the same thing could be said today. It seems so far-sighted, actually, for 1979. Foster at the EOC sought to build relationships with sympathetic employers to push for change in the form of the Equity Exchange Network, which included well over 100 employers. Meanwhile, the Fawcett Society, with Leslie Abdilla's 300 group, was working with the Hansard Society to generate actions to address low numbers of women in public life. In 1988, at a Hansard Society conference, which brought together campaigners and many of those employers, there was a sense already then, 1988, of political fatigue around the question of women's employment and a risk of, quote, reinventing the wheel. The problems facing women in employment, it was felt, were already well known. Any new initiative would need to use case studies of successful ways of addressing them. But these proved rather thin on the ground, and they tended to be the same few organisations each time. The conference led to a commission, which led to the Women at the Top report, which in turn led to the establishment of Opportunity 2000, later Opportunity Now. Employers on the commission criticised the research paper prepared by the rapporteur, Susan McRae, as overly pessimistic and bemoaned the usual list of remedies, including childcare provision. What they wanted to see instead was systematic monitoring. But I think it's interesting that the employers on the commission were split between more forward-looking organisations, mainly in banking and retail, some of the big corporations close to government or big international corporations on the one hand, and the CBI, which was being pushed into charters and voluntary codes of practice. Wilf Knowles, Policy Director and Assistant Chief Executive of the EOC, presented a paper to the Commission which set out 3 options. I just thought it was worth reviewing these because, again, they seem really prescient for 1988-9. First, continued voluntarism. Second, mandated duties for reporting and action, as in Australia, or a legal requirement for good faith effort in promoting equality and diversity, as in the USA. Anthony Lester QC, who had helped draft the Sex Discrimination Act, advocated the third approach in the Commission. Of course, at that time, the political will for mandated action was lacking and the CBI approach prevailed, in other words, continued voluntarism. Yet the Commission's surveys of employers in 1989 and 5 years later showed that in that 5-year period, despite this high-profile launch of the report, nothing had changed. Any serious monitoring efforts remained confined to those employers which were already in the EOC's equity exchange. I found in the Hansard debates on the Commission and its follow-up that the Conservative minister at the time, this was the Conservative minister responsible for women, who is a man, presented the actions of the more progressive employers as evidence that a majority, 70% of all companies, were putting in place positive actions to support women and employees. In fact, it was a minority of employers, so very small. So there was a real risk of campaigners' efforts being used as window dressing for government inaction. Moving swiftly on, it brings me to the Labour period and the women's policy machinery. In the 1980s and 90s, Labour's proposals for a Ministry of Women's Rights were partly fueled by a sense that the equality machinery, the EOC in particular, did not function as effectively as it should, and that any policy change would first need institutional re-engineering. As Claire Short has written, this initiative had 3 related strands, all aimed at feminising labour organisationally, representatively and programmatically, preparing for government. Reserved seats on the National Executive, all-women shortlists for candidate selection, and a new policy agenda with an emphasis on childcare, national minimum wage and rights for working parents. But this idea of giving women's rights an institutional presence at the heart of government was diluted when Labour took office in 1997. Women's rights were made dependent on the government department of the lead minister, whose status varied over time. This meant varying degrees of attention to the question of women's economic empowerment, compounded by frequent moves between departments, each time resulting in loss of impetus and often status, effectively countering the idea of policy mainstreaming through government. It never really took off. In the period from 1997 to today, during which I counted 11 government terms of office, including those taking place mid-term, I counted no fewer than 20 changes of responsibility at the top for, say, minister level for women in government, not counting split responsibilities at junior level. No fewer than 12 changes of location of the civil service unit responsible for women or women inequalities. As the Parliamentary Women and Equalities Committee argued in 2017, such a high degree of churn is unusual for government departments and suggests that, as the press often commented, attribution of the brief was not a high priority for governments. The battle for policy attention continued and required continual justification. One of the ways this was achieved was through data collection, but as Mary Ann Stevenson of the Women's Budget Group, who was then at Fawcett, commented in a foreword to my book, there was lots of engagement by ministers, lots of reviewing of evidence, but the action needed to see real change didn't materialise. But I think that the publication of annual gender pay gap data from 1997 by the Office for National Statistics did help to focus policy attention and continues to do so. It provides a focal point for campaigners. Back in 2001, it was the hook on which pay equity was raised in Labour's general election manifesto, thanks to party activism by women like Patricia Hewitt, Harriet Harman, and the work they did with Deborah Mattinson on women's perception of Labour as a party of and for men. By then, the EOC had convened its Equal Pay Task Force to mark the 30th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act. The task force set out to be broad-based and set out a range of policy actions aimed at building employer capacity, incentivising good employer practice and strengthening the law, making it easier to take cases to tribunals. It advocated mandatory pay audits, whose time had now come, according to the EOC's new chair, Julie Mellor. But by then, employer fears of legal liability had been strengthened by a wave of equal pay cases in the public sector. There followed a period of deliberation about the best way to persuade employers to accept pay audits, sometimes called pay reviews, rather than force them to do it and risk tick box compliance and subsequent backlash. And that was the context in which the Women and Work Commission was convened in 2004. The evidence about the gender pay gap was already there. It was a matter of pulling it together and seeing whether there was enough common ground between employer organisations and trade unions to push further on equal pay audits. There wasn't. The political will to enact mandatory pay audits wasn't there either. But the Commission was able to keep discussion alive a little longer, and some of the same deliberations found their way into the preparations for the Equality Bill, which set out an overarching framework for the different equality strands, including public sector equality duty. I'm going to really rush and go on to the Equality Bill, which became the Equality Act 2010. So I've mentioned public sector equality duties, don't have the time to go into that. Just to note that after 2010, the Conservative-led coalition minimised the scope of the English public sector equality duty, but it was subsequently taken forward in Scotland and Wales. The Equality Bill picked up on various strands of that debate about generational shifts in equality law, which had started early in the Labour years with the Cambridge Law Review. Part of this move towards a fourth generation of equality law, it wasn't just about expanding and bringing together the equality strands. It was also the idea of proactive duties aimed at stimulating reflection and responsiveness, rather than simply formal compliance. And I think that agenda remains a significant one today. So I'm on to the gender pay gap bit. The entirely voluntary Think Act report initiative followed the inclusion in the Equality Act 2010 of a reporting duty under Section 75. It was voluntary, but I've put here under the shadow of hierarchy, in other words, under the threat that mandatory action would follow if voluntary action proved insufficient, which it did with the 2011 initiative Think Act and report. Famously, 200 companies signed up to actions to monitor gender pay data, but only 6 companies did report publicly. So I won't go into all of the proposals that have been made to strengthen the gender pay gap reporting process, but those proposals started very early on with the Treasury Select Committee, campaign organisations. One that I would focus on, and perhaps we'll get back to it in discussion, would be to make action plans mandatory, as the EHRC has called for. And I think that could well be on Labour's agenda for government. Meanwhile, the proposal to extend reporting to cover race and ethnicity seems not only valid but overdue, and the Labour Party has committed to that, I think, still. So where are we today? We know that the reporting regulations have done something, that there has been some narrowing of the gender pay gap in those companies which are subject to it, but probably not as much as we might have thought, or certainly not as much as we would wish. So there's been indirect processes of empowerment, including, I think, trade unions I've spoken to, who have said that it does help sometimes as a lever for policy demands. But little impact on the sectors where the gap's highest, and I'm drawing your attention to the Treasury Committee's recent Sexism in the City report. It discusses exactly these issues of how to affect change and why multiple initiatives at organisational sectoral level do not necessarily lead to change. To my eyes, this example highlights the need for more effective use of regulatory escalation strategies in policy, using the shadow of hierarchy perhaps more deliberately and purposefully, which have hardly been used at all in the British context. And my last slide, and I know that I've got to be really, really quick, experimented with light touch regulation in the form of the right to request flexible working, which was introduced in 2002 and came into force the following year. Since then, it's been extended 3 times to address criticisms of the limitations in the initial implementation. First, to make it available to all employees from 2014, but still the qualifying period remained until the most recent extension, which has come into force this month, thanks to a private member's bill by Labour MP Yasmin Qureshi. This new legislation also allows a second application within a 12-month period. But it doesn't address this lack of formal monitoring, which I think is a big weakness in the legislation, because it makes it difficult to enforce, which in turn creates a weak sense of entitlement. We know awareness is low. And we could, again, discuss all of this in discussion, I think. But I just note that when Yasmin Qureshi recently talked about this about her private member's bill, she said she wanted it to be the start of a national conversation about flexible working that works for employers and employees. And that statement, when we're talking about a right that's existed for 20 years now, reflects the difficulties that have limited its impact in practice. And there remain notable absences from the current policy debate, but we could hope that those come up at the next election, marked by a preference for weak solutions to positive flexibility and the absence of solutions to negative or one-sided flexibility, as in the Taylor report. Have I got time just for a couple of kind of concluding remarks, Sarah?
Yes, sure, of course, Sue, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So given the focus of the forum on relations between employers and trade unions, I wanted to just end by highlighting gaps in regulatory approaches, which I've just had time to touch on. So the Equal Pay Act was adopted at the very time when that older regulatory mechanism of voluntary pluralism had been seen to have certain weaknesses, where government, certainly Barbara Castle, had tried to promote a more government-led approach and a more formal approach. And the way in which the Equal Pay Act was introduced with its transition period is one of those ways that Castle tried to do this. But that regulatory triad, state, employers, trade unions, was reaching its zenith at that time. And it was subsequently eroded by a return to individualistic marketised regulation. Labour's approach to very limited recollectivisation and more widespread introduction of individual rights provided only a partial response to that change, partly because of the weaknesses in the rights, exclusions, and so on. Since then, trade unions have been on the back foot in terms of seeking to redress the balance, although they've had some success at local level in adapting strategies to use individual rights through test cases to re-regulate employer behaviour. So I thought that might be something that people might be interested in thinking about in the discussion. How could such strategies be supported in future in terms of learning lessons from the past? And then just as a general note, I think I wanted to highlight that preparing this and thinking, and also in the book, going back to those debates in the 1980s and 1990s in particular, how much that idea of reinventing the wheel keeps coming back. You know, so many of those same comments could be said today. So many of the problems are the same problems. And of course, we have new ones as well, and new ways of addressing them. Partial solutions corresponding to those debates have been adopted, but the policy agenda begun with the adoption of those partial solutions continues, and it continues to be politically contested. I'm going to stop there.
Sue, thank you very, very much indeed. That was a real tour de force, and you got through an admirable amount in a pretty short space of time. So absolutely wonderful, and quite a few enticing questions to everyone here, I think, about issues that they might want to have a think about and bring back into the general discussion. The use of individual cases and the reinvention of the wheel. I think some of us feel we've gone around this wheel several times now, and as you say, some of the issues just don't seem to go away. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, another very distinguished person, and that's Kay Carberry, who's former Assistant General Secretary of the TUC. And Kay was another member of the Equality and Human Rights Commission board, and I think before that, the Equal Opportunities Commission board. She was also a member of the Commission on Women and Work that Sue referred to, and I think still is a member of the Low Pay Commission and more things besides Kay, I think. I mean, a very distinguished career. So let me hand over to you. I think we're very much looking forward to hearing your response to Sue, but also your own contribution about this period of time. Kay.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Sue. That was an absolutely brilliant presentation. I hope we can get into some discussion of the points that you left us with at the end. I thought I'd just say something about what it felt like in the trade union movement during the period that you've covered in your talk and in your research. For those of us who had been battling for years and years and years for women's equality, mainly in the workplace, but beyond the workplace as well. I think your phrase stalled revolution is great because it really sums everything up. I mean, I don't think any of us who've been working for women's equality for all those decades could say it's job done. I mean, progress is definitely and obviously in the slow lane, and there are plenty of examples of that I haven't got time to go into, but the metrics are out there if you want to look for them. At the same time, in many ways, women's position in the labour market and women's experience of going to work has been transformed over that period. And there are some really great employers out there. There already were great employers, but there are ever more as some of the ideas about how you deal with women's inequality have been more mainstreamed and more accepted. But one of the things that we have lost most recently that I think you can attribute as a cause of some of the putting the brakes on is that we have lost some of the champions we used to have who were in government, who had real power, who were our allies, who were people that we could work with. And I think that we have definitely felt the lack. And you mentioned some of those women, Sue, in your presentation there. So I just start by saying that my experience has been absolutely that you do need a supportive government behind you, and you do absolutely need individual ministers who are going to be your allies and your champions if you're going to get anywhere, if you're going to get any change in any of the domains that you covered in your talk there. But you can't take anything for granted. It's necessary to have a government behind you that wants to bring about change, but it's definitely not sufficient. Our experience over those years is you could come to the table with the most well worked out policies, you could have the most responsive ministers, but then you came up against reality on the ground. One reality, which I know is obvious, but it hits you quite shortly after the euphoria of a change of government dies down, is that you are not the only voice that government is listening to. And some of the voices that government is listening to are not voices that are saying the same things as you are trying to make heard. We knew even before that there was a change of government that we were going to have persuasive arguments and that we were going to have strong allies. I mean, allies like Caroline, I might say, allies among the most progressive employers. And we really did have to work those allies very, very hard. And we knew that it was no good also just presenting government with policies. We had to have ideas about how you could implement those policies. We had to be quite hard-headed about how things could work practically on the ground. I mean, that was one of the reasons why the Women in Work Commission was quite keen on some of their recommendations, which, as you say, Sue, were not fully implemented, were put into practice by way of pilot projects. And we were pragmatic because we'd learned that we had to be. Just something else to say about the importance of having people in government who are on your side. We found ourselves after 1997 working alongside people, some of whom you've mentioned, as I said, who had actually been campaigning with us when they were in opposition over all those years. And just a couple of examples of before we get a bit more pessimistic, the difference that makes. Just before 97, I went to a conference about childcare. Caroline, you might have been there, where the overall theme was childcare is a private matter and is nothing to do with government. The trade unions at that conference stood back and let progressive employers like Caroline and Fiona Cannon was another take the lead in the argument that that was the wrong way to look at childcare. But we got nowhere. Then Gordon Brown's first budget speech said that one of the first things that he was intent on doing was introducing a national childcare strategy. And he said that that was because he viewed childcare as an integral part of economic policy. I'm not going to go on about childcare because, as you said, you're going to have another seminar on that, but that was just an illustration of the breath of fresh air. And some of us were absolutely staggered to hear that because it was such a departure from what we've become accustomed to hearing from the top of government. And then also shortly after the Labour government came in, a group of us went to see Harriet Harman at her invitation when she was Secretary of State for Health and Social Security and also tagged on Minister for Women. And she said, as soon as we sat down, here we are, we've got this power, we've got to use it for women's benefit. What are we going to do? So there was all that energy and all that goodwill to start with. We were then knee deep in commissions and task forces and advisory committees and commissions and all of that. So why have we ended up, as you have described, Sue, in this position where we felt we were making a lot of progress, but it's all slowed down? And I think who used the term, both you and Sarah, we feel we might be having to reinvent the wheel. Well, quite obviously, there are pressures on governments. Governments have competing priorities. Translating all of our goodwill and the will to change things and our well-developed policies into any sort of real change was very hard work. It involved negotiation and it involved compromise. And if I can just illustrate that with two areas that you touched on in your presentation. So you talked about the Women in Work Commission, which made a whole plethora of recommendations after a year's work, looking at all the causes of the pay gap. When we got to the end of that process and we were making our recommendations, one of the reasons we, as you said, did not end up recommending mandatory pay audits was because that was a negotiation in which the unions were not successful. I mean, I'll just put it as bluntly as that, because there were other voices on that commission. We were never going to agree, although a lot of other very positive recommendations were agreed. That was a very long process, and we had to make our case based very much on evidence, but there were countervailing arguments that we had to deal with in the room before we came out with the set of consensus recommendations. You talked about where we've got to on flexible work. the right to request flexible work came out of a task force that was a representative task force which had women's organisations, employers' organisations and the trade unions and the EOC represented on it. That again was a process of gathering evidence and a process of negotiation and a process of compromise. If you think about where we are now, the start of that process was employers' organisations saying, okay, we can think about allowing parents and others with caring responsibilities to make a request to work flexibly, but it should only be available to people who have children up to the age of 1. That is how we started off. And some of us personally came up, experienced a lot of pressure from the top of government to row back. So, for example, I was arguing very strongly that, okay, it's only a right to request, it's not a right to have. But if an employer was going to be refusing, there needed to be some very good reasons that ultimately could be tested in an employment tribunal. And we got a really insipid, watered down version of that, because that's what emerged from the negotiations, which by the end of it got, I might say, rather brutal. And there was a lot of pressure coming from outside the task force. So again, I go back to this phrase that you have to make your argument, you have to be prepared to negotiate, and you have to be prepared to compromise. That was my experience of that process. Then you found the whole process of transposing EU equality directives and parental rights directives into domestic law, pretty fraught. And at one point, the TUC even brought judicial review against the government to try and get more favourable implementation of the parental leave directive. So none of it was easy. And clearly, over the Conservative years, some of the progress that we were able to make has fallen away. That was your conclusion, I think, Sue, of your presentation as well. Even though we've got many more progressive employers, and it's not as difficult as it was for women to progress in the workplace. And so we now look forward to another period of Labour in office, where we know that we again have got particularly women ministers, potential women ministers, but not only women, who are on our side and who will help us. But we have already seen in the discussions over the last few weeks about the plans for the New Deal for working people, that we're going to be up against some of the same difficulties that we were in before, and that we will be back in some of those same processes. So my overall conclusion is that we have to remain relentless. We have to not assume that anything is going to be automatically handed to those of us who want to advance women's interests. We have got to be prepared again to make our arguments. We have got to be prepared to deal with all the countervailing arguments that are going to be made to government and those people who've got power and have got the power to make things change. And basically, we've got to be practical and pragmatic and do it all over again. That's where I'd end up.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. That was incredibly wise and insightful, and has triggered all sorts of memories that I'm not sure I particularly enjoyed, but it's very, very important to remember what's happened. And absolutely, as you say, it looks as though we're going to get a Labour government. I probably jinxed the whole thing now. but negotiating with them and remembering that there are other parties in the room is absolutely critical, and picking priorities carefully. And I'm sure those who've succeeded us will be, planning to do what they can, but we have to be quite mindful of the realities of what a Labour government can do. But thank you so much for picking up all those points and a lot of insights into what it was actually really like doing all that incredibly hard work and very effective work that you did at the TUC. And that segues us neatly into our last but not least final speaker, Caroline Waters. Caroline, as Kay said, and I think as Sue said, was one of our key allies at the TUC. And it must have been quite difficult sometimes, Caroline, to be talking to, you never saw us as the enemy, and that was the great thing. And we were always able to have really reasonable, constructive discussions with you. I remember you both as the Director of People and Policy at British Telecom, which was a unionised company and still is, I think. Yeah. You were also Deputy Chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission for quite a long time, and that can't have been easy at all. Rather a troubled organisation. And then, of course, you were also Vice Chair of Carers UK, a very important organisation. And I remember meeting you a lot in that context, and indeed being on the EHRC with you. So to our ally, to talk about the employer's, I don't want to say side after everything I've just said, but the employer's perspective. Caroline, looking forward to hearing your contribution to the discussion tonight.
Thank you, Sarah, for the very kind introduction, and also for the invitation to join you this evening. And of course to Sue and Kay for their provocations. I mean, as Sarah said, I had a wonderful opportunity to be part of over a decade of policy making at BT between 1997 and 2013. And it was a time when our workforce was being transformed as women joined in larger numbers in a greater variety of roles, returned to work after maternity leave and stayed with us for longer, enabling them to pursue careers and not just take a job. They were a vital part of our workforce capability, although the value of their work and capability wasn't always recognised, even when they were doing a man's job. Of course, BT did have a proud legacy of female employment and amazingly issued its first equal pay letter in 1948. Can you imagine that? It hung on my office wall to remind me that it was okay to think and act radically. And I had to build policy on top of that kind of forward thinking. It was amazing. Now, those original employment opportunities, though, had been based in a contemporaneous concept of women's role in society, and therefore what work was appropriate for women. That certainly didn't include climbing poles or leading men, I can assure you of that. The 1980s, however, heralded a time of great change in our employment practice. Women found their voice through networks, through union membership and employer-led speak-up programmes. Their needs were often the catalyst for broader change. Women struggling with employment and domestic demands brought the question of work-life balance to the table. We understood it was also an opportunity to become better employers for everyone, and the flexible movement was born, the flexible working movement was born. BT had already kind of figured out the benefits of flexibility for greater efficiency and customer service way before my time, introducing 9-day fortnights in 1961 for over 100,000, almost entirely male engineers, and had 300 home-based workers by 93. It wasn't until later that we realised it provided a way to attract and employ women, parents, carers, disabled people, and those from ethnic or marginalised communities. And of course, there were barriers, as you've already heard, but as a business, we knew we couldn't address them all by ourselves. We needed activism in the workplace, and we needed to be a part of that. We needed it in politics and in society to build a whole new way of working that was fit for workforces of previously unimaginable levels of diversity. As that policymaker, I needed partners, and that was the mindset that we brought to this. We wanted to know what people needed, to understand how to turn that into practice, to prove it was good for business as well as people, to ensure it was funded and respected by business leaders. And sometimes we needed change to legislation and public service infrastructure to make it work. Of course, we needed to persuade the labour market that good work and employment was opening up to a much broader group of people, many of whom had learnt that work, let alone a career, wasn't designed for them. Our partners were BT's people networks and union colleagues, without whom we would not have successfully embedded flexible working or closed the equal pay gap. Also government departments, individual MPs, cross-party groups, charity, employer, research-led coalitions. We worked with them all because each one of them provided an important piece of the overall jigsaw that we needed to create change. I was very lucky. BT was a very future-oriented organisation. It was keen to embrace every demographic as a potential employee, supplier or consumer, determined to do good by doing business, not just having policies on the side. And that meant that for me, the progress in employment, procurement and marketing had to be incorporated into policy and practice across the business, because this degree of change would take time. It wouldn't happen overnight. And as we learned more about the complex nature of the barriers to women's employment, we realised that it required some things to be enshrined in law or provided by the state as universal service. For example, with so many women juggling caring responsibilities and work, regardless of what we did as an employer, they would not be able to access the world of work if the person they cared for couldn't access good quality local services. We also needed legislation to ensure that the gap between great employers and poor employers couldn't become a competitive advantage for the wrong sort of employer. Maybe this lack of a floor for employment practice is why the UK lags behind comparable countries on gender equality indicators, despite having good EDI process. Public policies in areas such as protections for agency workers, sick pay, enhanced and shared maternity, parental leave, minimum wage, etc., were critical in attracting and keeping women at work. It was becoming clear that flexible working options had to be taken up by men too. Until men had access to the home and family, women would never have greater access to work. Childcare, elder care, extreme jobs aren't minority issues, they are every worker issues. So we needed government to step up with market making activity. Not quite their forte, as we subsequently discovered, but now more critical than ever in our post-COVID world. Feedback from our people networks and union reps ensured we were aware of barriers and helped us provide what solutions we could. But even then, it was clear that public policy had to provide the necessary social infrastructure. Women told us they needed good quality local childcare and elder care, accessible and affordable housing and transport, or many parents and carers would drop out of the labour market or end up working below their capability in order to get the flexibility that they needed. This meant that business had to form a new way of engaging with politics and public policy agendas, a more strategic approach to try to inform and steer public policy towards key workforce enablers. It gave business a new voice and was generally welcomed by politicians and policymakers. Many of those were the people that became our allies in this battle and spoke with us and for us. It wasn't all plain sailing, of course. Individual businesses such as BT were sometimes too near the leading edge for those employer-based organisations like the CBI or FSB, who represented more traditional industries. We quickly realised that we could be the best employer in the world, but it wouldn't make a real difference to women's opportunities unless there was also cultural and behavioural change in society. To get what we needed for our increasingly diverse workforce, we had no choice. We had to influence and work with Parliament and the government's future policy agenda. Sometimes tangentially, flexible working was becoming established, but women told us they needed flexible travel cards and season tickets to make it cost effective for them to travel to work when required. And infrastructure change ministers needed to push with providers, but an employer's voice helped. From an internal policymaker's perspective, the political activity helped us to keep things on board agendas and push through meaningful change, enabling a longer-term, more strategic approach. The Blair government set out a clear vision for equality, and in my experience, were generally good communicators and listeners. They consulted informally and formally and helped business buy in. To varying degrees, this was also true of the governments and certainly of individual ministers and allies that followed. Markets and economies can be easily spooked by change. It was important for nascent markets and workforces that there were few surprises and that where possible, voluntarism was allowed to run its course. Constant changes in departments and ministers meant this wasn't always the case though, and there was little continuity, and it was frustrating and difficult at times to restate the whole case. I mean, certainly I felt like I stood at the back of the room for 20 years saying, and carers, and carers. But I think progress was also stalled because too many employers were able to maintain less progressive, cheaper employment offers or options, or use progressive policies in non-progressive ways. For example, the now demonised 0 hours contracts. We originally used them for retiring engineers wanting to do a few hours now and then, for which they would receive pay and refresher training when needed. A great solution for blue-collar workers wanting a glide path into retirement and to prevent loneliness, turned into vulnerable employment for workers with few options by businesses that should know better. The introduction of equal pay audits, representation reporting, the right to request, as we've heard, both flexible working, carers' rights, were all helpful in providing women with the information and access they needed to take control of their own destiny. You can now look at which employers are fair pay employers for women and make a choice about who you work for. It also highlighted what actually worked to employers too. What I learned was that it takes all of us to create great public policy. We need to understand problems deeply and look for strategic solutions, data that we can readily turn into information, internationally informed research to highlight opportunities and pitfalls, practical knowledge about what works for, in this case, women of all ages and backgrounds. We need the voices of employers, people networks, trade unions and activists, social nudges to change attitudes and behaviours, clear measurement, support from Treasury. God knows that was one of the hardest things we ever tried to get. Focus on the social issue, so that, you know, upon which so much relies, and all tied up neatly with clear delivery targets and deadlines. I'm probably slipping into some kind of utopia now, but I really think that's what it takes, as well as that continuity. But for me, it all starts with transparency about the issues our society is facing now and will face in the future, and a clear vision for the sort of country we want to be. I'd like an incoming government to set out that vision and to engage all of the actors in developing a shared future that works for all of us this time, please. Thank you.
Caroline, thank you very, very much indeed. Again, fantastic amount of insights. And I remember so well the different perspective you had to come at it all from. But I remember your integrity and your commitment were 100%. And you had so many sort of brilliant ways of interpreting what we in the government, I'm talking here about the TUC and the government were trying to do. So thank you for tonight. And thank you for all that in the past as well. Let's open up to everyone else who's in the room. Who would like to start? It doesn't have to be a question. You can just make a contribution, whatever you want. If you want to ask a question of a particular speaker, it would be helpful if you just indicate who it is you'd like to get an answer from. But who'd like to come in? If you just use I can't see you all, so you'll have to use the little hand icon if you'd like to speak. I see no hand icons. Is there anyone out there?
Stunned silence.
Fantastic. I see Alison. I think you can unmute yourself.
Yes, yeah. I'll give it a go. I'll give it a go.
Yeah. Alison, hello.
Hi, sir. How are you doing? Thank you all. Lovely to see you, Sue, Caroline. Trip down memory lane. Sort of tangent. I'll have a go at two questions. We've seen a real increase in women working full time since the pandemic. How do we think we're accounting for that? Given the ongoing issues with childcare and, and then we know, don't we, we've got now another bubble of women who are saying that actually going to work is just not affordable. Cost of living crisis, each family needs dual income. So we've got something coming out, and the labour market's tightening up as well. And then on the new default flexible working, I mean, I'm asking my students at the moment to do an essay on the conflict between employers who want flexibility. So, 0 hours contracts, move people around from different functions and stuff. And people who want flexible working. So do we think COVID has made a huge difference in terms of flexible working and hybrid working? Is that here to stay?
Thank you very much, Alison. Just before I invite our speakers to come back in, while they're resting their voices still, I can see John Edmonds has his hand up. John. You need to unmute, John.
The great temptation, which we've all fallen into at one time or another, is to regard the future as a rerun of the past. And there will be very many features, but just to pull out two things that won't be the same, there'll be more women in the cabinet than there were in 97 and thereafter. And there will be many more women in the Parliamentary Labour Party than there were after 97. Now, the pressure, therefore, is to ensure that those people are properly organised and are really pulling their weight in terms of within the government about ordering priorities that are good for working women. So I think there's a great opportunity there to make use of the change that is going to take place. The other thing I wanted to say is one lesson that I learned from, as Sarah said, that rather difficult period after 97, is that we must have a minister for employment. We haven't got one now. How we are going to get through sensible employment changes without a minister prepared to press for that within government and beyond government, I don't know. So at every stage, the first object is to make sure that there is a minister specifically responsible, and make sure that she or he is, of course, very well disposed to the arguments that we put, but there must be one there. Otherwise, this might just sort of blow away like cotton wool in the wind. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. And I see Emma Barrett. Hi, Emma.
Hi. Sorry, I'm just trying to put my camera on. Hi, thank you. Those were very interesting talks. Thank you so much. I research women in the City of London, so finance and law, and I did a lot of oral histories for those. And I was really interested, it's perhaps, well, it's a question to everybody, but perhaps Susan in particular. Again, I pin a lot of my sort of analysis on reports, sexism in the city, etc. But what do we do with modern histories, well, contemporary histories? What do we do about the archive? I suppose that's my question. It's very difficult to get into business archives, banking archives for the relevant periods. And, it just feels, what do we do as historians about that other than just looking at reports? I'd be really keen to know what people think.
Cool. Thank you very much, Emma. And I can see William. Just have a first name for you, William.
Okay. Yeah. I want to ask a question about how can woman or about labor in the UK can completely do anything besides recession. Now in the UK, especially every day have about recession. How can the woman in the UK can deal with that? Thank you.
Thank you, William. I can't see any other hands going up at the moment. Do any of our three speakers want to come back? I think there were a couple of questions directed at Sue and some more general ones. Sue, do you want to come back in?
Okay.
Then I'll do the other two as well.
Yeah, there's quite a bit there. Food for thought there. On Alison, on the full-time working thing, I have looked at this and I don't know the answer to it. I think that is a research project, honestly, that needs to be done. So definitely there's something there. I suppose it's a case of, will it last, and what's happened to the part-time employment. Yeah, I haven't seen anything, but I think definitely it should be looked at. On flexible working, I think you're asking, and the COVID impact. I've done a little bit of work on that and trying to do some at the moment. So I got quite excited actually looking at some of this last year. Yeah, last year, looking at policies that have been brought in, that there seemed to be the shift, and it was in that period after the initial lockdown and in the period when people were talking about hybrid. So, there was the kind of first thing of, oh, we just need to get laptops to everybody so they can do remote working. And then there was a longer phase of trying to think through, and some really innovative policies, I thought, that have been quite widely discussed, particularly in banking, actually. But what seems to be happening at the moment is that those are being unravelled. So I'm trying to investigate what's going on, because that seems really disappointing to me. And is someone? Sorry, I just got some feedback from someone. So I think that the impact has been short term, and that's my fear anyway. I'm trying to investigate that a little further. I mean, so I've talked to a couple of employers who are saying, but this is a longer term thing about young people who are coming into the labour market are expecting more flexibility. They're expecting to have more time autonomy. But the thing is, if the organisation isn't geared up for that, it doesn't really matter, because what will they do? They'll leave and they'll go somewhere else, and we've seen that happen quite a lot. And it seems to be what's happening, where you have employees who've got used to, I think somebody's maybe echoing me back, I don't know, where employees have got used to having a certain amount of flexibility in that hybrid working period, and it's being taken away. What are they doing? They may be leaving companies and going elsewhere. So another really good sort of research agenda, I think, there. And then I agree with you, John, that this is something that I have been thinking, well, both things I think you said I've been thinking about recently, because it's clear that women's parliamentary presence has made a difference. It's made a difference just in, keeping things alive, linking with campaign organisations, being prepared to do that work of, it's thankless work, it must feel like, putting in the private members' bills, getting them read out or fail, and then just keeping trying, just keeping going, hoping that there'll be a drip, drip, drip. But I think that has been really important. And there's also been the learning through the networks and the Women and Equalities Committee that I think will continue. So I think, yes, definitely there's something there that can be built. I was rushing so much in my talk, and I did want to pay tribute to the work that was done by women in government, and to note that when Harriet Harman, when Patricia Hewitt were in those ministries, high status women, high status departments, things moved. So we know what makes the difference, and we can hope that will happen again. I think on the Minister for Employment, yes, I don't know what plans are there. Again, I've been thinking recently about a sort of lack of real thinking, and it would be great if that fed into election debates about the labour market of today, that goes beyond just this kind of thing of, oh, AI is just going to come in and take all the jobs. There have been some interesting reports more recently that have been looking at those trends, but I think and also, so if you listen to Woman's Hour today and thinking about young women in the labour market, what's happening with the jobs at labour market entry, what's that telling us about where jobs are likely to be in 10 years, 20 years time? It feels to me like, again, all of that work, evidence gathering and reflection on it still needs to be done. So a focal point for that in government will be really, really important, and taking proposals forward. Your point, Emma, about archives, this is something I'm really conscious of. And again, you know, so for example, you can look at the records of the commission I talked about, the Women at the Top Commission. You can look at a lot of the work that was done when it was on computer cards and all the rest of it. But so much has disappeared with the internet, you know, and even the archiving that was done by the National Archives is just sporadic. You can still find things, but you can't rely on it as a historian. So I'm just inventing lots of research agendas here, but there needs to be some kind of agenda about what is it that we're doing with recent history and making sure that all of this just doesn't disappear, because I fear that a lot of it already has. I'm sorry I didn't quite get your question, William, but maybe others can comment
maybe
on
William,
that.
perhaps pop it in the chat box. That might be helpful, because I think you're coming to us from outside the UK, and I think the connection was slightly, I didn't completely catch it either. So William, if you're still there, if you could perhaps pop that into the chat box, and then we can come back to it. Caroline, did you want to comment on any of the points raised?
Two great questions from Alison. The only trends that I'm aware of in terms of women in full-time roles is that there's been, you know, some growth in the employment of older women and younger women, both of whom perhaps are not in the caring role. You know what I mean? So the access to full-time working is there potentially for them. And also we know over the years that there's been quite a significant increase in households where the woman is the main earner. And it may be that, you know, economically that is the better decision. So that we are seeing that change in roles. Now, I'm speculating really. I know these are two things that are happening, but I don't know whether there is a correlating factor for why we are seeing more women working full time. I think also in terms of the default flexible working, the reason why flexible working was so successful at BT was that we were very clear that it was a balance. It was a commitment for commitment. It had to work for the business and it had to work for the individual. And also it was reason neutral. That we thought was really, really important, because as a line manager, I was skilled in determining what impact that individual's attendance pattern had on my ability to get the job done. I wasn't qualified to understand what it meant for that individual to care for their grandmother or to struggle to pick children up or anything like that. We had to keep it in a proper relationship, the business represented by the line manager and the individual saying what they needed, but without having to talk to us about things that they might feel uncomfortable about. And I think that's really important. My real problem with what's happening post-COVID, and I think it was particularly clear in the public sector, was this sudden concern that buildings were empty because we'd got people working from home and working from other places, and the rush to refill them, which is just nonsense. Buildings are just part of your infrastructure. You know, work is something we do, it's not somewhere we go. So it was old thinking saying we need to come back, we need people back in buildings. Why? We can reuse those things. We can think about, you know, doing different things, creating housing, for example, but, you know, not to go there. But I think that rush to get people back was not really grounded in anything sensible in that case. The whole fear about that people don't build engagement with the company or engagement with their colleagues, I think is valid. And it has to be worked at, but it can be done still with flexible working principles at heart. John, I think you're absolutely right. I think if we don't have a Minister for Employment, what we will continue to get is part solutions, where solutions need to take into account things like employment, transport, all of those other things. We will it will be slow to change if we have to work across departments. We need somebody who has that remit to be able to bring it all together and make it work.
Thank you, Caroline. And Kay, did you have any? I'm sure you have got some thoughts on the contributions.
Yes, thank you. The question about women's working hours, I think that it would be really interesting to look at which segment of the labour market we're seeing a growth in full-time work. I suspect it's at the lower end of the labour market where people are feeling the pressure of the cost of living crisis, and where we already know that there's a very high proportion of workers who feel underemployed and have been looking for more hours, both women and men. And so I don't really know where there is an overall growth, and maybe you already know that, Alison, or maybe there needs to be more research. I don't know which part of the labour market we're seeing that. And I agree with Caroline that it's also interesting to look at in which age groups we're seeing women working more hours. And I suspect that it is not women in the child rearing years, because it's still very difficult for all the reasons we know. One of the things that has not quite come up, but I think is relevant when we're thinking about women's hours and also the quality of women's hours, is that one of the arguments that several of us, including people who are leading the Equal Opportunities Commission, started to make 25 years ago, is to remind people that men can be parents as well, and that some of what we needed to do to advance women's equality in the labour market was to look at what men were asking for in terms of ability to look after their children and spend more time at home at particular times in their working careers. And I think that that is an argument that we haven't ever won, and we haven't ever translated into practical policies, even though we're talking about a quarter of a century of trying to make these arguments. And I'm sure that we all know families, young families, where women, where there's young children, the women are staying at home, and women are taking fewer hours and are unable to increase their hours in the way that they might want to, because their partners are forced back to work because of the low levels of paternity pay, very paucity of paternity leave in some employers. I'm sure not in BT, Caroline, because you're a pioneer in all of this. But I still think that that is an area that we need to work on, and we need to kind of remarshal our arguments and reactivate our champions in government. And talking about those champions, you're quite right, John, that there will be more women in government, and we hope that we'll see a woman chancellor. But I still think that the memory that we have all got of very early on in the Labour government of Harriet being wheeled out to defend cuts in benefits to lone parents is still, for those of us who are old enough, very much engraved on our brains. I think that it's not going to be necessarily as easy as we might hope for those women, because they are going to be subjected to all sorts of pressures from all sorts of directions as part of the government. We all know it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be a bed of roses for a new Labour government with what they're going to inherit, and that's been much commented on. And I think that we have to tailor our expectations of what those individual women are going to be able to achieve.
Thank you very much, Kay. Would anyone else like to contribute? We're getting towards the end, but we can take another if anyone else has something they want to say. Yes, Janice.
Thank you. That's been absolutely fascinating. But I've been trying to link it back to what you had in the blurb about the seminar or the conference, which is going to be the development of policy over the last 3 decades, and ask why it has proved so difficult to make progress towards a more gender equal society. So I'm part of the Patricia Hewitt generation, both English and Australian background. And it just occurred to me that there seem to be some aspects in England in particular, and I don't know about Britain in general, but especially to do with things like misogyny and the attitudes of men, things about educating girls and young women, because it seems to me a lot of young girls and women I talk to think, oh, we've won it all. We don't need feminism anymore. We've done all that. Now we have to move off in different directions. Also about learning more from overseas and what is done there in terms of policy and education and so on. Being more gung-ho, like the suffragettes were, because it seems to me that we've actually lost an awful lot of our determination to go ahead and win battles in Britain. And I think a lot of that is to do with the austerity that we've had to put up with for the last 13 years. And the cutbacks and so on. And I also wonder about things like carers. I mean, if you look at them at the moment at what's going on with regard to how carers are being put up in legal situations and having legal actions against them because they've earned, 60 pence more a week in benefits and so on than they should have done. Why aren't we all protesting about that? And it just made me think the other day, perhaps what we should do is get a completely different attitude to carers, including childcare and caring for elderly parents and so forth. And why couldn't we get together some sort of group action against the government and say, we think all carers should be paid £19,000 a year. I worked out the figures on the minimum wage and so forth. And we want that now. And we're going to take out a class action against the government. And I would rather it was the government we've got at the moment than say if a new Labour government does come in. So all these kinds of things have been through my mind. And I'm just wondering, how can you relate all of this to what the situation is currently and what might come up if we do get a new Labour government?
That's a fantastic contribution, Janice, and thank you very, very much indeed. That unfortunately it is towards the end. However, it gives me the chance to say that this is the first in a series of seminars on issues pertaining to women and equality. And as I think Sue mentioned earlier on, the next one is going to be on childcare and work, and that would be followed by others on equal pay and on flexible working. And I'm thinking, in the context of what you've said, that we then need to have a wraparound session where we're recording this. I should have said that at the beginning, but we obviously wouldn't quote anyone without asking them first. But maybe we need to draw together some of the fantastic ideas that have come both from our speakers tonight and from other people who've contributed, and see if come up at the end of this with some sort of ideas to put to, I would hope by then, a new Labour government, particularly in areas like you're suggesting, the possibility of, I don't know, marshalling some cases, if that's what it takes to give them a shove, but certainly to start having some kind of input to an incoming government, and using all the wisdom and experience that we have here, both on the academic side and all trade unionists and employers such as Caroline, and try and make the most of all this wisdom that we have, and not keep on reinventing wheels, and try to be a critical friend to an incoming Labour government, and perhaps steer them into a coherent strategy. As Caroline pointed out, we've never really had in the UK a sort of basic floor of statutory employment rights. It's all a bit piecemeal, and some of it relies on all sorts of old-fashioned common law contract and so on and so forth. So it's all quite a maze. But we'll make sure that you all get invitations to future events on women in employment, and indeed other events. I know my colleague Jim Mower here is going to be running an event on the 2nd of May on international trade unionism, which I hope at least some of you will be interested in. I certainly am. But I think really it now just comes to me to thank very much indeed all of our speakers tonight. It's been fantastic hearing from Sue and from Caroline and from Kay, all of which made fantastic contributions with so much insight into what's been going on in the past, what we need to be looking at, experiences that we can draw from, and areas that we can try and move forward in. I think it's been an absolutely fantastic evening. It's been a privilege to have been able to chair it. We have got it recorded, so the forum can have a look at that and see what we can extract. But thank you all very much indeed for your attendance. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm conscious that this is the evening and you probably all want to get your dinner and so on. And I'm also conscious that the Zoom mechanisms are probably just the sword of Damocles hovers over us with the technology, and we'll probably all get cut off at 7 o'clock. But thank you all, particularly to our speakers who've been absolutely wonderful. It's lovely to see everybody again. And thank you all very much for participating. There are a few comments in the chat box if anyone wants to look at those before I shut us all down. But thank you very much indeed again for coming along, and do look out for our future events. Thank you so much.